Welcome to the MBN Solutions Boss and Data podcast. In this episode, our topic is cultivating inclusion. The technology sector has long been accused of not being truly representative of wider society. From ethnicity to gender and on through areas like neurodiversity and socio-economic background, it often appears that there is a very distinct type that is likely to succeed, particularly at leadership level within tech and data organisations. However, over the last 10 years or so, it could be argued that this has begun to change and that a newer, more diverse group of leaders have started to change the power dynamic within the sector. Joining me to discuss the topic in more detail is a leader who currently leads buy-side client experience for a fintech startup, working with the finance market to drive data-driven efficiency, transformation and market acceleration. She's passionate about bringing market participants together to collaboratively problem solve and initiate change. Her prior experiences in the finance sector, having worked in investment operations where she worked with a well-known investment service provider and with a retail bank during her time at university. She sits on His Majesty's Treasury Task Force for Accelerated Settlement, as well as the FinTech Scotland Cluster Board. She uses this latter platform to advocate for the fintech community in Scotland and specifically to support diversity and young talent in the sector. Welcome to the show, Pardeep Cassells.
Thank you, Rob. Great to be here.
Disclaimer before we go any further, Pardeep's views and opinions are entirely personal and she is not here to represent her company in any way, shape or form. And with that out of the way, happy International Women's Day to you.
Happy International Women's Day to you. Glad to be spending some time with you today talking about diversity. It's the right day for it.
It is indeed the right day for it. And thank you again for taking the time out of, I know, a very busy schedule to have this conversation with me. It is very much appreciated. Par, thanks for agreeing to join me. And you and I have been getting to know each other a little bit better over the last few weeks. But for the benefit of the audience, can you tell us your story? Where do you come from? What's been your journey? Where are you now?
Okay, so technically I come from Irvine on the west coast of Scotland. So born and raised, second generation Indian immigrant. I went to university in Dundee. I studied law, did a postgrad diploma in legal practice as well, and then joined a French investment bank in 2009. Started off in their Dundee outpost doing reconciliations, which I know is a bit of a kind of sideways step from the old law situation. But what was required at the time, I graduated at the height of the financial crisis, and those trainee placements were hard to come by. And had a friend who joined BNP Paribas and said, hey, you can come give this a go. It will tide you over. We'll see how you get on. And I didn't leave. I was there for almost 10 years, I think is basically how that happened. Did a number of different roles during my time there, was fortunate to benefit from a lot of really strong leadership and support, even in situations that were maybe sometimes a little bit like difficult to navigate being a young person starting their career. And then 4.5 years ago, made a move from that investment bank into Access FinTech, where I work today.
And we're going to have a conversation later about all that change and transition. But we'll begin the conversation looking at that topic of cultivating inclusion. And when in your life did you become focused or aware of the importance of the topic within your professional life?
Such an interesting question. I think when you are an Indian growing up in a very non-Indian environment, you're kind of aware of inclusion and exclusion at some level from a very, very early age. And I think it's kind of common, certainly was the case for me, where you kind of dampen that feeling down. Right. So you kind of learn to live with just always being a little bit different. And I carried that through. I carried that through university, carried that into kind of working life, and certainly had a few interesting situations, both in my university job and my first kind of proper grown-up job as well, that continued to kind of remind me that actually I'm always going to be a little bit different. I'm always going to stand out a bit. And it took a long time, I think, to build the confidence to just own that and say, actually, do you know what? It's okay to be Indian. It's okay to be a woman. It's okay to reach a hand out to people who are neurologically diverse, have different academic backgrounds, socio-economic backgrounds, and that everybody has kind of earned their right to be in a particular room at any particular point in time. I would say, yeah, it's come with age and confidence.
And when we spoke last, you had mentioned that there had been some challenging times. It wasn't all plain sailing, and perhaps those challenging times have helped to form your character and the person that you are today.
Oh, absolutely. Everybody learns through adversity, and by reacting to difficult situations. And I certainly had my share of hard conversations, or at times actually feeling really quite excluded, and having to kind of fight to overcome that or get that addressed and recognized. I think I always benefited from quite strong leadership who, on the very rare occasions where I felt brave enough to call this out and say, actually, this is a problem, this is actually impacting work, it was taken seriously and kind of looked at. In the main, I think, and anybody who knows me will agree, that my personality is just quite tough. And I think my current chief exec would tell you I'm a marshmallow underneath that. So you kind of develop, or certainly I have developed, a bit of a tough exterior that really comes from, well, when these comments are made, you kind of just have to let them slide off you. You can't let them land. You can't let them penetrate. You shouldn't show that you're upset or wounded by them, because then that's showing weakness, and then it could get worse. So I think psychologically, it's really interesting how those scars that you can carry if you have always been very different just percolate through life. So yeah, I think if I wasn't Indian and I wasn't a woman growing up in the environment that I was growing up with, I would probably have a different personality.
Yeah. Yeah, and you also mentioned about home and your parents and the way that you were brought up, and that experience of being, people who came to this country, and then how did that temper things for you? What kind of I suppose, what kind of example did they give to you, or how did your interaction with them help to shape and form who you are now?
Yeah, I think it was always an interesting thing. So I'm completely bilingual, to the point where I actually think Punjabi was my first language, and like English came second. Not that you could tell with this accent, but I'm pretty sure that's kind of how it came about initially. So at home, we were an Indian household. We ate a lot of curry. We went to Godhra on Sundays. But outside of the home, my parents always encouraged us to be in the environment that we were in, two-footed. So I went to school in the west coast of Scotland. The schools I went to were Protestant schools. Never missed a church trip. Sang in the school choir. So my parents' take on this was always, we've chosen to live here and be here, and you need to be brave and immerse yourself. And so that's what we did. And when it didn't work, or when there was bullying or challenges at school, my parents, I'm the eldest of 5 kids, by the way, so my parents backed each and every one of us to the hill. And as an adult, I think that's even more interesting to look back at, the impact that their confidence in me and my siblings and the belief that they had in us has forged who we are, because there was never a moment of doubt for them. There was never a kind of, oh, be a bit quieter, like, don't do this, don't lift your head above the parapet. It was, get out there and be brave and do the things that you're capable of doing. And I think I said to you when we spoke, I use this quote a lot, and it's a Mindy Kaling quote. So Mindy Kaling, obviously American Indian actress, I think first generation immigrant. And she said this really interesting thing at a point in time, which was that her parents raised her to have the confidence of a middle-aged white man. And that just really kind of carries her through. She just doesn't know any better than to own the space that she's in. And I think I'm lucky to have been raised in a household where my parents very much did the same.
Great. You spoke about that leadership within a professional capacity, but you'd also spoken and written about the importance of allies within your own personal story. Could you elaborate on that? Why have allies been so important to you?
Everyone needs a friend at work, right? So I think everybody needs that support system, the people that you turn to and say, this has been a bad day, or I don't know what I'm doing, or that was a bit weird. Do you think that was?
That was a bit weird, yeah. That's one, yeah.
So I think having allies, having friends, having supportive colleagues, I don't see how anybody survives without that. And I think when you're maybe a little bit different, or you have things that make you feel a bit more vulnerable, having those allies actually becomes even more important, because that's the reminder that, like, you're okay. So for every potential negative comment or perception that one person might have, I think I described it in a blog that was published this morning as having a village. I've had the support of a village. So for every negative voice, I know that there are dozens of positive ones to drown that out.
Yeah, and it's something that, I mean, and it's obviously from my perspective, because I am that white middle-aged guy.
And I'm just as confident as you are, Rob.
Yeah, one of the things that I've worked on purposely is to try and let people know that I am the ally.
Yeah.
Because it can be very, very difficult, because you know that sometimes it's easier to just keep your head down and your mouth shut and just go about your business. But in the scenarios that you're describing, or the scenarios that we discussed, there's a dance to be made there, and somebody's got to make the first move. And sometimes it's easier for those that are inside the tent to make the first move, to show that, hey, I'm an ally, I'm supportive, please, dance towards me, because it's just an important thing. And I think today, as we kind of celebrate that contribution, an hugely important contribution of women in the workplace, and beyond the workplace, I think it's important that we recognise that there are a lot of people out there that are allies, and you're trying their best.
Absolutely. And in all shapes and sizes, right? And International Women's Day, obviously, like a very focused situation, a very focused event. So the way that I would look at it is that there's layers to that allyship. So I'm, I guess, an intersectional example of this as an Indian woman, but I in turn have a responsibility to be an ally to others, to my queer colleagues, to my neurodiverse colleagues, to my colleagues who come from different socio-economic backgrounds and maybe don't have the same polish, refinement background as some of the clients that we might come up against. So I think as much as I benefit from allyship, and I really have, I think I name-checked a dozen people on my LinkedIn post earlier today, and they're all people who I have so much affection for, and simply I wouldn't be who I am without them. But I owe that in turn to other people around me. Like, I have a responsibility to be an ally to those who aren't the same as me.
Absolutely, pay it forward. Now, we touched on this earlier on, but I said we would come back to it. And you work in an industry, the disruptive industry that is fintech.
Yeah.
Why did you leave traditional financial services?
I have a very charming chief exec.
Good answer.
I sure do. So, like, I had a great time at BNP Paribas. I really did, and I laugh with my friends who still work there and say I'm probably the poster child of that particular organization. Like, genuinely don't have a bad word to say about my experience there. And I was afforded genuinely an incredible amount of freedom, and now was like more of a grown-up than I was when I worked there. I look back at it and think, my goodness, you let a 25-year-old set up and roll out functions that didn't exist. What? Like, how did I end up so lucky and so fortunate? And it was through the allies and the support system that I had. But 10 years in the same organization, even with lots of change and lots of opportunity, you kind of reach a point where you think, well, what happens next, and where do I want to go? And as we know, in Glasgow, there's a particular kind of triangle or quartet of organizations that you typically move through. And I remember having a career conversation with the now COO over at BNP Paribas Security Services, who's in the office here in Glasgow. And I said, I think it's maybe time for me to start considering a change. But I'm not going to leave you just to go do the same thing in another bank. Like, if it's time to go, I think I want to do something really different. And a little while before, I'd been introduced to Roy, who's the chief exec and co-founder of Access FinTech. And he'd shown me a demo of what his company were working on. They were tiny at the time. And I remember going home to my husband that night and saying, if that guy ever offered me a job, I would take it in a heartbeat. Right? So I was so into what this company were doing that I knew instinctively, and actually was so impressed by Roy and his leadership and his passion that it was a very kind of clear-cut thing for me. If he ever comes looking, I will go work for that man and his company. And just the way that these things go, about 2 weeks after I had the conversation with Mark at BNP Paribas, Roy called me up and said, I've got a role. Are you interested? And so I followed him here. Up until that point, I'd never considered working in a fintech. Had no idea what it would entail. This was not a calculated career plan. Yeah. I kind of knew I didn't want to jump from one bank into doing the same role in another one, but I didn't know what different would really look like. Right. So Roy, genuinely on the basis of 2 or 3 interactions with me, threw this door open and said, hey, I think there's something that we can do together over here. And I jumped at it. Like, I think it's that straightforward. I jumped at it. So 5 months later, I'd moved myself down to London for about 4 months to immerse myself. I went from working with an organization of hundreds of thousands of people into a 40-man fintech. I think there were maybe 5 or 6 women working for the company at the time. I laughed that the London office very much smelt like a boys' locker room because they used to come in after the gym and leave and go to football practice. Right. And there were definitely moments of, what have I done? But they were incredible. I was made to feel so welcome by the team from the outset, like fully just included in whatever nonsense they were up to and whatever was going on. It was a really lovely, lovely experience.
I've got 2 obvious supplementaries here, but I'm going to focus in on one. And it's from what you've said earlier in that life experience through childhood, through university, through your career. Do you think in some way that's prepared you for this move? In other words, some of that fire, some of that courage, some of that confidence that you've needed to go from the traditional to the disruptive. Is this maybe where you're supposed to be?
It kind of feels that way sometimes, right? I think I just have a disruptive, confident core. I didn't come in shy. Let's put it that way. I did not come in shy. So yeah, I think it's an interesting question, because sometimes I feel very corporate and very much like a banker. So when I'm here at Access FinTech talking about guidelines and processes and documentation and structure, I think they want to throttle me sometimes. But at other points, I wonder how I ever survived 10 years in an investment bank. I think right down to when you and I were speaking the other week, you told me I could swear to my heart's content on this podcast because my day-to-day language is just littered with profanity to quite a remarkable degree.
Colourful. I think we would call it colourful.
Right. And I've been quite good so far during the podcast. But I guess I have freedom within this environment to just be very much who I am, and it's accepted and celebrated. And no facet of my personality, whether it's me being a woman, me being an Indian, none of it really comes into any sort of negative or perceived kind of negative environment. It is just, we're all in it together. And I guess I'm going to steal one of your questions now, I think. But
You're not allowed to do that.
Sorry.
Cool.
I guess what helps me be even more comfortable and settled that that's the case is how diverse we are for a small organization, right? So we are 150 people globally, but we speak something like 22 languages. We have 16 nationalities. We have recognized neurodiversity in the workforce, gender diversity, we're LGBTQ positive, like all of that. And in such a small company, to have that level of diversity, it just brings you comfort, right? If you're used to feeling like you're a little bit of an outsider, a little bit of an anomaly, you're not working in the fund accounting department of the investment bank, all of that sort of stuff, right? To be in an organization where you're surrounded by people who aren't fitting any particular mold is great.
You have stolen one of the questions, but that's okay. No, that's okay, because what we're going to do is we're going to go back one, then we're going to go forward one with a slightly different take on this. Now, you spoke about the importance of allyship and those allies to you, and now your role as an ally.
Yeah.
And you've joined this organisation and you've taken steps to make it truly meritocratic.
Yeah.
Your own observation when we spoke the other week. But for those listening in, and for those maybe perhaps who are on this journey, what practical steps have you taken to achieve where you are now?
So I think there is a tendency within any organization, any leadership role, for people to kind of subconsciously recruit in their own image, right? And that's how we end up with certain stereotypical organizational structures. Me recruiting in my own image doesn't look like many other organizations in Scotland, right? So I was very fortunate to be given an opportunity to find a location here in Scotland. So when I finished my 4 months in London, I was kind of sent home with an objective to start hiring for certain roles up here and to set up an office location. And what that allowed me to do was take the Access FinTech culture and see how far I could push it, right? So the positive steps that I took were, wow, I'm in an organization that actually champions women, that looks at people, gives them platform and opportunity based on their merit, their skills, because I changed roles 3 months after I joined, right? They brought me in on a certain role and looked at me and went, actually, we think you'd be better doing this thing over here just now. So let's just immediately give you that chance without having you jump through 75 hoops and 16 interviews. Get it done. So when I first started recruiting in Scotland, I was able to consider, what roles are we bringing up here? How do we want to go about that recruitment? What should the office look and feel like? I formed relationships with recruiters, so that as a practical step, and was very, very clear about our mission statement here. We wanted a fun workforce, a diverse workforce. We wanted to bring in candidates who were right for the role, but a good culture fit for our organization. We took risks on people from really diverse backgrounds. So I remember there's 2 individuals, and they know who they are, who I literally hired at the same time in Glasgow. And one of them is your stereotypical perfect mold, right? Glasgow University graduate, got a master's, went to work in a tier 1 bank, decided after 2 years they wanted to do something different, very polished, very articulate, very young in their career. And the other person who I brought in at the same time, they went through the interview process at the same time, very different background, had worked until their late 20s, put themselves through university as a mature student because they wanted to do more, actually ended up working in the same tier 1 bank and was also looking for something different. So they'd ended up at like the same spot, but through very different routes. Were both looking for change, but the way that they were being viewed by other employers were kind of poles apart. And I still remember calling the recruiter and saying, I'll take them both.
Oh, and you've made somebody's day with that.
And he was like, you're what? And I'm like, I'm going to take them both. I like them both. They're very different personalities, but I can see the potential in each of these individuals. Let's have them both. They're both still here. They've both changed roles during it's actually their 3-year anniversary today. So happy anniversary, ladies. but they have come in, grown, developed, come into their own and been allowed to flourish in the same environment, despite being very, very different people. So that's the important bit, right? I leaned into, and we as a business have leaned into who they are and their strengths as individuals, but backed them and supported them. We're about 25 people strong in Glasgow now, with every business line except sales covered here. We take the same approach to everyone. We've brought in a marketing guy who's wonderful, who was working for 3 mobile phones when we brought him in. Like, we are absolutely digging in and saying, look, if you come in, you're a marketing person who's brought an interesting portfolio. I don't care that you've never worked in finance or technology. We can teach you that. Yep. Come on down. And our run of hiring goes from hires like that to the gentleman who usually sits next to me and isn't in today, who did 18 years at Morgan Stanley, has traveled all over the world working for tier 1 banks. So it's that. How can you make the most of the talent pool that's available to you? And how do you recognize and celebrate their differences, their individual contributions, and help each of these people maximize their potential?
Yeah, and rather than, I think you made the point earlier on about that hiring in your own image.
Yeah.
It's the easy model. It's the default almost. But if you deliberately try and ensure that what you're doing is starting from a position of cognitive diversity and getting people who think differently, then the likelihood is that they've probably came from a different background, they've got a different worldview, they've got different experience, and you're therefore much likely to have true. I think the easiest way I always think about it is as a true representation of different opinions. Absolutely. So you're much more likely to come to the right choice rather than just 10 people who look the same, act the same, and come from the same place saying, yeah, you're right, mate. Yeah, of course.
We think the same. So it's a running joke within our office and across my organisation. You don't need 2 of me, right? Nobody wants 2 of me, right? Yeah. What we want are people that, to your point, think differently, challenge each other, because that's how we push each other to be better and come up with the right ideas at the right time and execute it in the right way.
We've sort of drifted into the supplementary on this one, but acknowledging this difference, but why disrupt the status quo? Why do you feel it is important to go against the grain?
Because I was already there. So I think for me, that's just, there is no other way. I'm never going to walk into a traditional client meeting and look like most of the people around that table. Yeah. Right. So there's kind of this element of, actually one of the ladies who works here in Glasgow, actually worked with me at BNP Paribas as well. You can choose whether you keep this bit in or not, but I guess it's kind of an example of how that works in real life. When I was younger, I had my lip pierced, and I'm also relatively heavily tattooed, right? And this lady worked with me at BNP Paribas. She was part of my team. And every Friday she would come in with a lip ring in and studs in her nose, right? But they weren't there during the week. Right. And eventually I said to her, what are you doing during the week? Because these appear on a Friday and I know how sore it is and how quickly your lip starts to close up. What are you doing? Oh, well, I just go home every night and put the piercings back in. And I'm like, oh, that actually makes me feel a little bit unwell. Mm. So we start talking about it, and she had a very clear corporate view of, it's not appropriate for me to be in the office with this stuff in my face. But at a human level, that's who she was. Mm. So we eventually reached a compromise where I basically forced her to start wearing plugs so that at least they weren't closing up. And to this day, she still laughs that she never had a boss that actively encouraged her to wear her facial jewelry into an office environment. But that's who she is. So why not? It doesn't diminish or detract from her ability to do her job. She suits them. She likes them. They give her confidence. So why are we diminishing that on a day-to-day basis? It's a small example, but that is diversity, right? It doesn't have to be these massive things. Am I male or female or
protective
Caucasian?
characteristic things? It can be just appearance. Yeah,
totally. It's like, be comfortable, be confident in who you are, and let me help you be as comfortable and confident as you can be, because that's how I'm going to get the best out of you. So I guess at its core, encouraging someone to wear their facial piercings into a French bank environment is disruptive, but I never saw anything wrong with it. So
I can see it. And I think you alluded to it earlier on. You've always been different. You've always been not what's in the room already. So therefore, it's not different for you to be different. You just things should be different.
Everybody should just do what, be professional, but just be different. You like having tattoos, like have tattoos. That's awesome. Like, just do what you need to do.
It's a side tangent. It's wow. And I was tattooed in the late 80s.
Okay.
And I remember my father being horrified.
Mine still is.
I think his words were, only sailors and convicts have tattoos. What are you doing with yourself, boy? Right? And they're not visible. You would never know unless I decided to show you. And I think it's fantastic now that body art, and it is, to me, it's body art, is now an accepted part of even corporate culture. You see people in, and I've been in some very prestigious organisations up and down the UK, and I have seen people with visible tattoos, and I think that's a good change. That's a good change, because from the 80s to now, it's a complete difference from what isn't considered acceptable in terms of the body art being visible. I think it's great.
Totally. So I think my little running joke there is, I can walk into a room and you won't see any. So you said yours are only visible if you choose to show them. Yeah. When I walk into a room, you won't see anything. But when I go to leave, by which time I've hopefully impressed you,
you can see them.
And it doesn't make a difference anymore.
Well, mine are upper arms. I've had two in my upper arm for a long time, and they're just there. But I've always been of the opinion that that's an individual's personal choice. I choose not to show mine in a corporate environment, but other people do. And they should be allowed to do that and respected. And we shouldn't be making disparaging judgments because somebody's got body art visible.
Totally. So I know it's like a funny tangent, but for me, it all shades and flavors of diversity kind of boil down to the same thing, which is, let's not judge other people, put down other people for not fitting into our vision of what the right mold for any particular environment is. And that extends to all of this, right? It extends to gender, it extends to ethnic diversity, neurodiversity, and right into like body art and body modification.
Absolutely. Now, you've spoken about within your own organisation and how you've worked really, really hard on this promotion of difference and diversity in it. But let's look wider across the rest of the fintech sector. Is there a consistency? Do you see your organisation replicated elsewhere? Is it different? Is it the same? What do you see?
That's a really interesting question. So I'm fortunate in that I have come across and formed like lovely relationships with a lot of very strong, very successful women in this space. I know that when we start looking at data, I think the typical female to male representation in the fintech sector is about 14% female to 86% male. Within Access Fintech, we're globally at over 30% female to about 70% male. In Scotland, I think it's more like 50-50. So no, I don't see us reflected as well across the sector as I would like. I think there's work to be done there. I think in terms of ethnic diversity, it can be quite an interesting thing to look at as well. There's a lot of South Asians involved in the fintech sector. And when you look at really large technology companies, there are a lot of Indian CEOs of huge technology companies. But what I find really interesting is that if you look at senior leadership players, that tends to dissipate. So we have very successful kind of CEO level diversity in some regards. You have a relatively diverse kind of, I'm going to say, more junior workforce, right up until maybe middle management. But I definitely find that when we're then talking to senior leadership teams, ExCos, they do still tend to be very male-dominated, very Western.
Just an interesting point you made there about the gender diversity within Scottish fintechs. Any thoughts on why that?
Fintech here, so
what?
that's within our office.
So not 50-50 universally?
No, so within Access Fintech, it's 50-50.
Okay, and the numbers for Scotland, the fintech as a whole?
So the number that I just cited, that 14%, is one that has come from work that I've done with Fintech Scotland. So that's a number that they cite. I believe that's a UK-wide stat.
That's what I was going to say, yeah. So, and that's a worry.
It is.
That to me would be a worry because, and back to the point that we were discussing earlier, reasons for leaving the traditional banking model and coming over to the disruptive area. I think there's a question here around some of the risks that might be associated with just replicating the old model. What do you think about some of the risks and downsides that might be out there?
Yeah, I think I want to look at it in two different ways. So thinking about the fintech sector on its own, we kind of have this challenge where we know that female-led startups get less attention and less investment than male-led startups. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but there's a huge disparity there. And that needs to be solved. So female potential founders need more attention, more coaching, more money to let them thrive and do the things that they're capable of doing. And I think that is critically important to kind of growing this workforce. I think that move or that transition from finance into technology for women becomes an interesting proposition. This was a risk, right? And I guess, interestingly, Roy was always very clear with me that I was taking a risk. What if it doesn't work out? If I don't have a children, but if you're a mum, is that a risk that you're willing to take? Do you prefer to stay within a safe bank environment where you have usually very generous maternity packages, pension setups? There's an element of it takes a particular risk appetite to want to leave that behind and come into the technology sector. So I think part of it is understanding what would attract more women and make them feel more comfortable making that shift. In terms of repeating patterns, though, I think one of the things that we do need to be mindful of is that I think fintechs tend to reach a point of scale where, particularly in my sector, right, so within investment services style fintechs, where in order to get access to subject matter expertise, access to people's black books, they need to go into the banks and start pulling out people from those banks to come join their fintechs.
Right.
There can be a tendency there to start opening up to patterns, right, where the people that you're bringing in are the senior leaders from those banks. But if the senior leadership is dominated by white males, that's who you're bringing in. They are going to be more mature in their careers, potentially, or a lot of the time. And so then you're bringing them into a startup at quite an elevated level. Yeah. And it's a good thing in some ways, right? It helps grow the fintech. It helps add stability, maturity, names that are all important. What I think all fintechs need to be mindful of is not then dampening down the people that came in earlier and who were diverse and willing to take the risk, and their opportunities potentially being limited because now you're taking the bank old guard and bringing them into a fintech universe.
I got you. I'm just looking at the time here. We're almost at 40 minutes. Can you believe we've been talking here for 40 minutes? But we are unfortunately coming towards the end, and the end is always the same. And there are two questions that go back to back, and one asks you to look forward in the future a little bit, one asks you to look back. So the first one is just looking at the horizon over the next 5 to 10 years and looking at your own journey and the way that you know, the country, the sector, your professional life, looking at what change has happened. What change do you envisage coming in the next 5 to 10 years?
I would hope to see more women and more diversity in senior and leadership roles. I think we need to do more to attract women into STEM, to bring them into this sector from the ground up, and mold them into tomorrow's female leadership. I think in the next 5 to 10 years, I would hope to start seeing the results of that effort, because I know we have organisations like FinTech Scotland, like the investment banks, who are, I keep pointing behind me because they're literally across the road, those guys out there, really investing time into students. We do a lot of university talks as well. I want to see more women in those rooms, interested in those careers, and in 10 years for us to be seeing those women then thriving and growing within this sector.
I'd spent a number of years working very closely in the university sector. That's not where my fears lie. My fears lie in school. My fears lie that we are not, as a society. I've got 2 young granddaughters. They are as digital native and tech savvy as you could ever imagine, but I'm hoping that their academic journey continues to encourage them towards adoption and usage of advanced technology, and that they're given the confidence to believe that they can have a career in that space. I just don't know if we're doing enough between home and university to ensure that who's applying to university for technology courses is representative of society. That's where I've got my fear.
I think that's really fair, but then I would ask you to look at the difference between parents 10 years ago and parents 10 years in the future, because my mum and dad had no idea what I was doing when I said I was going to start working for a financial technology company, right? And computing is something that was kind of beyond them, right? If I were to have children now and put them through the school system, my view of what you do in technology would be very, very different. So I think there's an element of the encouragement at home from parents who will better understand what a technology career is, and that it isn't that I want to sit around and play computer games.
They'll be digital natives themselves.
Yeah, we'll hopefully help with that.
Yeah, okay. Last question. Final thoughts. If you could jump in that Wayback Machine and speak to yourself 10 years ago, what advice on the subject of cultivating inclusion, based on what you now know, would you give yourself?
I would spend less time being worried about what people are thinking of me, about me, and about my differences, and just lean into them, I guess, in the way that I do today. Because nothing bad, touch wood, has come of that, right? So I think what I would do is encourage my past self to set that concern aside about voicing discomfort or issues or like something that didn't feel right, and the risk of rocking the boat or causing a problem, and just being more vocal about where we could and should be doing better. And yeah, I think that's what I would do.
Amazing note to finish things on. Par, thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time. Look, I really enjoyed it. Thank you for sharing your passion, your knowledge and your expertise on the theme of cultivating inclusion. And I hope you, dear listener, have enjoyed the conversation as much as I have. And if you have, please take a moment to review the show on your podcast or video platform of choice, giving us 5 stars, obviously, and share this episode with anybody you feel would benefit from a view or a listen. Thanks. Please do look out for the other guests in this podcast series, where I'm joined by other special guests discussing topics relevant to today's bosses and data. Make sure you're hitting whatever button you need to hit to subscribe to the show, please. Visit mbnsolutions.com for resources like our UK data salary survey, to watch recordings of our latest data meetup events, or to download our white papers, research and thought leadership. Follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram and Twitter for the latest news, views, opinions and, of course, hottest opportunities in the data space. Goodbye.